come to heart. We'll help you claim your place in the workforce of the future.
Like these trees, we need our economies in the region to grow and develop. When economies grow, we can create jobs, provide and support social services, improve our standard of living, better manage our debt, concentrate on diversifying our economies, invest in new ideas and technologies, and build resilience. COVID-19 has caused the tree to wilt a bit. Economic growth across the region, especially in the tourism-dependent states, fell dramatically, particularly in the first year of the pandemic. However, we're beginning to see small shoots of growth. Forecasts vary about how soon or sharply we will bounce back. The International Monetary Fund predicts that Latin America and the Caribbean economies will grow by 6.3% in 2021, moderating to 3% in 2022. The emergence of more transmissible COVID-19 variants, the uneven distribution worldwide of vaccines, international financial conditions, and high debt levels heighten uncertainty among economists and world leaders about growth and sustainable development. How can we get the tree to sprout and our economies in the Caribbean to recover and grow and our development to be sustainable again? Dr. Hygienist Jean Leon, President of the Caribbean Development Bank, Dr. Carla Barnett, Secretary General of Caricom, Brian Louisi, Chairman, the Network of Caribbean Chambers of Commerce, and Dr. Nigel Clark, Minister of Finance and Public Service Jamaica, will help us understand how our Caribbean leaders and technocrats will promote economic growth and development in this vulnerable, uncertain, volatile environment. I'm Tony Thorne, your host for the Central Bank of Barbados' Caribbean Economic Forum entitled Promoting Regional Economic Growth and Development. A critical topic because the same way we need trees to grow and protect our environment, we need strong economic policies to protect and to safeguard all of our lives. Good night to all of our viewers across the region, and a special good night to our panelists. I'm really excited to talk to you tonight. We have a lot of questions, a lot of views, but we don't have that much time. Good night, panelists. How are you doing? Let's delve right into some surveys that we got. First question. Are you aware of what your government is doing to promote growth and development? 53% of persons unfortunately said no, and 47% said yes. How can policymakers better promote growth and development in your country? 25% said involve people in the decision-making process. 23% implement youth development and training programs. 7% said strengthen regional integration. 20% said simplify doing business. 17% attract greater foreign investment, and 8% said innovate. What is the biggest obstacle to growth and development in the region? Size got 3%. Glad to see that. Our mindsets, 37%, not good. 15% our education system. 27% limited access to funds. 5% natural disasters. 13% insufficient human resources. That 37% makes me sad. But I'll answer my first question to our panelists. And I'll start with Dr. Barnett. Dr. Barnett, given the fact that you lead one of our strongest and most reputable regional institutions, and taking into consideration the survey results, what are you particularly doing to promote economic growth and development?
And it is a pleasure. The Caricom Secretariat is one of several regional institutions that would be involved in treating with heads and treating with all of the issues that heads are facing at the regional level. And at the national levels, of course, all of the reality of what has happened as a result of COVID in this last 20 months faces us. The impact of COVID has been particularly bad in terms of the impact on tourism being one of the major growth drivers in the region. And when the tourism floor fell out in March of last year, literally when our airports were closed, we had thousands of people out of jobs, literally. So that stopped the flow of foreign exchange, that stopped the flow of government revenue, it stopped the flow of salaries into people's pockets. And the reality of that, the impact of that was that governments had to find ways, first of all, to ensure that people could eat, that small businesses could get some stimulus, that they could begin to hire, focusing on the local market. And even in tourism, we saw a greater emphasis on promoting local tourism. So even though the airports were closed, we saw more and more people locally and regionally traveling. The result of all of this has been that we've come to realize a couple of things. A lot of the stuff that we were talking about before, the need to innovate, the need to include ICT development into the way we produce, sell, consume, all of that has become now one of the most important things. The way governments deliver services using the IT, so that e-government has now finally risen to the top of everyone's agenda. And all of these things are going to be really very important for us to transform our economies and do the things that we've been talking about a long time. And there's a greater impetus now for addressing these things. One of the critical things that we are focusing on in CARICOM, aside from what I've mentioned, is the transformation of agriculture. One of the things that happened as a result of COVID, when the airports shut and the sea shipping routes got disrupted, we didn't know where the food was going to come from, because we have a, 50 billion, 30 billion, whatever it is, food bill, import bill, but we couldn't determine that we were secure in our sources of food supply. And so the emphasis now on making sure that we are investing in an agriculture sector that is more modern, that can produce food more efficiently, all of that has become very important. And these are the things that will enable us to be able to transform our economies going forward. And it, as I was telling some colleagues a couple of days ago, it's not that these are new things that we are aware of. It is just that COVID has put all of this for us in really sharp focus. And so we know that we have to get all of these things done to transform our economies and our societies. And we're setting about to do that.
I'm glad that you spoke about transformation. Very, very great response from you there. But I am going to now go to Mr. Louisi. Mr. Louisi, what examples, because you sit in a position where you see a lot of chambers of commerce, what real examples of innovation are you seeing across the region?
Well, I think the private sector responded and were forced to respond really quickly to the COVID pandemic. And I think we saw persons very quickly start to pivot, start to be creative, and start to be bold in terms of their responses. I think we could look across the region and we could have seen persons suddenly getting into the delivery of food, because you had situations where supermarkets were closed and there was the social distancing. And suddenly supermarkets were making it available for people to order online, and young business entrepreneurs were starting to set up and actually seek to become delivery services. You saw people recognize, okay, I could no longer depend on the local market, but I could offer my services across internationally. And people started to recognize that, look, we need to survive. The business community across the region has to play a significant role and has played a significant role in development. And I think they had to be at the cutting edge of change, of adaptation, and recognizing that they needed to retool, refocus, unthink the way that businesses are conducted. How do you continue to provide services? Work from home quickly became something that was possible. The use of technology and people recognizing that you didn't have to do things the way you did them. Necessity is the mother of invention, and COVID necessitated a response and reaction, and the private sector has done so in numerous ways.
Thank you so much. Dr. Leon, how are you?
Fine, thank you, Tony.
I wanted to ask you about our small populations. This is something that comes up. Do you think that that thwarts our ability to compete globally?
I actually do not think so. I think we have for too long limited our perception by physicality. And so we have continued to think, because we have small size, because we have few resources, that means we cannot compete. Now, in a sense, that is correct, in that we would be looking to compete on physical terms. What I think we need is to rethink, reimagine what exactly are our areas of comparative advantage. And for me, I start from the perspective that we do not have a comparative disadvantage when it comes to knowledge creation. And to the extent that we now have the technology of digital technology, to be precise, that allows us to essentially get rid of physical boundaries and to allow our imagination to take us to realms that before we could not even begin to comprehend, tells me now that we can actually compete not on the basis of small size, but on the largeness of our unbounded imagination. And so for me, size is the wrong measure to use. If we can simply tap into that unboundedness of our imagination and what we can do through the power of knowledge creation, then size does not really matter.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Dr. Leon. Quite interesting intervention there about us using our imagination as persons in the Caribbean to help transform the region forward. Going forward, how do you think our region can actually foster this innovation and promote economic growth in such a way that our development reflects who we are as a people?
Thank you for this. I think the question really boils down to, one, what is innovation? And innovation, the way I want to think it through, is the ability to use what you have or the finite resources you have to greater effect to produce and create. And so my sense of how we can use the concept of knowledge as a means of growing is essentially to recognize that there is one basic concept, philosophy even, that underlies the entirety of human existence. And that is, you first accumulate knowledge. You then need to diagnose that knowledge, looking for particular success and inhibiting factors. And then you need to transform that knowledge that you've acquired into strategies for something different. And that is what I am suggesting, because we do not have that comparative disadvantage in the knowledge creation process, then it means we are at liberty to what I call the industrialization of knowledge, by creating markets, products, services that in effect translate each of the elements of knowledge accumulation, diagnosis, and strategy creation into industries, products that can in fact become the backbone of our development, where we would in principle move from the Lewisian concept of infinite supplies of labor, moving you from agrarian into manufacturing industry, to one of an infinite supply of knowledge, where we can utilize infinite source to create ad infinitum as much as we wish, and create industries and products and services out of this that we could export, to the extent that I think we could transform all of our economies from import based economies to capital exporting economies, and create competitive, high-priced, high-value-added concepts that can be sold on the global stage.
So I'm going to ask a question, and I'm going to start with Dr. Clark, and I'm going to go around the room, virtual room. And I tend to ask it at all of the CEF conferences, but I think it's a really important question. Dr. Clark, are we too reliant on tourism as a region?
Okay, one of the things the pandemic has shown is, our vulnerability to shocks from tourism, and showed that having huge concentration risks makes our region more susceptible and more vulnerable generally. That is not to take anything away from the fantastic product that each of our islands offers in terms of tourism. And, you don't throw away what you have. You use what you have to get to where you want to go. So I definitely believe that from the economic base that we have, we should definitely be making steps to diversify our economies, even as we seek to maximize on tourism and to grow tourism as quickly as possible. But that should not be the sum total of our economic strategy. Our economic strategy has to be wider and broader, and embrace other ambitions that help to reduce our dependence on tourism, and to further diversify and therefore strengthen our economy and make it more resilient.
You sit in a very powerful seat. You are the Minister of Finance and Public Service in Jamaica. What is Jamaica currently doing to diversify its economy?
Well, this has been a long-standing effort for Jamaica. Our traditional economy is based on the traditional sectors of bauxite, of sugar, bananas, and for the last several decades, tourism. And we have sought to diversify away from that. We have been making big inroads into business process outsourcing across that vertical, with different stages of the value add chain. We are also seeking to ensure that we can get a strong foothold in logistics, given Jamaica's proximity to the trade coming through the Panama Canal between between China and the eastern seaboard of the United States. And logistics offers huge opportunities for Jamaica. And then, we'd be seeking to ensure, Jamaica has a strong base of financial services, and that can certainly, it certainly is an area where Jamaica leads in the region. And then we'll be seeking, Jamaica has been making a comeback in manufacturing. We have restructured our economy. Manufacturing has been growing over the last few years and growing quite consistently. And then, what we want to do is to ensure that we use education as a tool for growth and development. And we believe that if our people are better educated, and if we have the best-in-class infrastructure as regards technology and bandwidth and broadband, then that provides the springboard from which entrepreneurial activity can lead to greater diversification of our economy, even in ways that we can't plan centrally.
Thank you. Dr. Barnett, do you think that we are too reliant on tourism as a region?
Across the region, there really is a heavy dependence on tourism. And as the Minister of Finance of Jamaica said, the risk in that was really exposed once we had the COVID pandemic. And so across the region, we're seeing more and more diversification efforts take place. And in truth and in fact, this would have started before the pandemic, and the impact of the pandemic has brought it really into focus, as I said before. For some of us, I am from Belize originally. I live in Guyana now, so that's the mainland territories. And so agriculture remains important in those economies, and we will see a lot more investment in that sector as we move ahead. And of course, in Guyana, we're seeing the rise of the petroleum industry, and that is also a very dynamic thing that's happening within that economy. So there's a fair amount of economic diversification taking place. The business process outsourcing that Minister Clark mentioned is something that's important in several other territories. And the reason why it's growing in importance, of course, is because of our strategic location, close where there's a demand for services, and also the fact that we are English speaking, and the English speaking, the fact that we're English speaking is an asset. Our younger population are very much into IT, and BPOs are dependent on IT, on the infrastructure that's been put in by our various countries. And so those things are enabling us to diversify the sources of income, and that is good, but there's a lot more effort that is required. What we do in education is important. What we do in terms of making business easier to be conducted, that is the whole issue of doing business in the region, and the ease with which it is done is something that is always brought forward on the table. So we have to address all of those issues, and we need to address them not only to attract international investment, but to also make regional and domestic investment something that we incentivize.
Thank you very much, Dr. Burnett, for that response. We as a region definitely have been using ITC to transform the way we are. And it's important to note the English-speaking advantage we have. Good night, viewers. I would like to apologize for my colleague, Tony, who has lost connectivity. And so apologies on her behalf. At this time, I'd like to direct the next question to Dr. Leon. Dr. Leon, you have previously spoke about the concept of measuring. Measure better to look at targets. That is the concept of measuring. How do you see it as being implemented as a worthwhile recommendation for transforming our region as we go forward? How do we better measure our targets going forward?
Thank you for that question and the opportunity to elaborate on this. I think we have to first understand what do we mean by targeting. Targeting is clearly the ability to be clear in our articulation of what we need to do. And to be able to be clear on what we need to do, we need to have a good understanding of what it is that we are trying to achieve and how that can be undertaken. And so that's what generates the concept of measure. Measure, in a sense, is a quantification of the entire process chain that allows you to move from diagnosis to the solution in question. And I want to probably introduce this a little better by using an example. The typical person who plays darts has a clear idea of the target. It's to hit the bullseye. And so that's an intent that they would like to do. But to be able to hit that bullseye, they need to have a, I want to call it evidence-based structure, a technique on how you're going to hit that bullseye. And it might look like they're just throwing darts, but it becomes a very comprehensive and complex process of being able to rebound from Earth in terms of physical pressure, translating that through the body, through the shoulders, into the hands, being able to measure now the propulsion of that energy through the air, capturing the idea of the resistance, the weight of the dart, the angle of the trajectory that will in fact give you a high probability of hitting the bullseye. And I think the same parallel holds here. It tells you there's a lot of interconnectivity. There are a lot of parts that have to hang together and hang together in a perfect way to allow you to hit that target. And so when I use the concept of measure better to target better, it is to say if we are to reach the goals that we set ourselves in a development sphere, we have to be able to measure the entirety of the ecosystem, which is what is development. And development for us is this holistic, multidimensional approach that includes the socio, the economic, the production, the finance, includes the institutional, includes the environmental. And all of those need to move together in a way that can advance and self-perpetuate that system. And so the measurement element for us then is, how do I measure the way that ecosystem advances, the interconnectivity within that ecosystem, that when I begin to move the ecosystem, it can move coherently to be able to meet the target in question. And so that's the underlying basis of measure better to target better. So how do you actually first bring this into reality? It's the question you were asking. I think the first is we need to have a holistic concept of development that includes, one, the principle of resilience building. Second, if you are to generate resilience, what sorts of investments that you will need to be able to target? And if you are going to do this, at what cost in terms of the ability to have finance, the ability to get around your debt situation, and to be able to do it in a sustainable way. So that is one element of the measure better to target better that CDB is actually pushing forward. The second element of that is, how can you actually utilize that? And one of the ways you can utilize this is clearly through what we are saying now. We have an issue in the region where our vulnerabilities are not appropriately captured in things like access to finance, in that we use gross national income as a means, when I say we, the international community, as a means of classifying ourselves. What if we could now measure the concept of developing states' vulnerability better? Then we can actually generate better targeting of that very finance that we need. And so we have now come up with this idea of a recovery duration adjuster that takes into account the length of time it takes our economies to recover after a shock as the basis on which we can better target concessional finance to help countries develop. So it is a very broad-based topic. I use 2 examples here for you, but it equally means that we need to identify not only that connectivity that I've spoken of, but the use of more information, more data. And there we can think immediately of things like the use of big data. What if we can mobilize data that can help make better policy decisions? So, for example, being able to map the entire coastal space of the region, both nearshore and offshore, as a means of considering the impact of rising sea levels and what this might mean for different increases in temperatures from climate change, as a means now of creating a set of policies that can now target the idea of a sustainable development going forward. So all of this is about, as I said, measuring, understanding, knowing linkages as a means then of targeting policies designed to achieve specific goals in a way that is much better than if you did not have this apparatus of discovery and strategic transformation to achieve the goals in question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Leon. Thank you so much to our media coordinator, social media coordinator, Anki, for that wonderful question. I have a follow-up question. I'm going to start with you, and then I'm going to go to Dr. Clark. I have a question about that bad 4-letter word that begins with D, and it's not data, it's that. And it might be a controversial question, but do you think that we have romanticized the idea of borrowing as a quote-unquote illusion of growth? I'll start with you, Dr. Leon, and then I'll go to Dr. Barnett. And if we have enough time, definitely, sorry, Dr. Clark, and then if we have time, Dr. Barnett, Mr. Louisi.
Thanks, Tony. I think we need to be careful. We are not mixing concepts. Debt is a stock. It is the accumulation of borrowing over time. And you borrow over time to hopefully invest in quality activities, quality projects that in principle should generate growth, assuming you do it well. So there is a link between the accumulation of debt and the activity that is generated from that. And so in principle, you can say you need to have more debt to be able to grow. But at the same time, if you are also able to grow because you did those activities appropriately and you implemented them well, the larger growth pie that you would have engineered would now allow you to be able to repay that debt that you would have taken in the first place to create that new activity. And so the relevant measure is the extent of your ability to remain solvent, to be able to repay your debts over time. And so debt in itself is not the issue. It is when debt has gotten to a limit that is overpowering, overburdening, and uses up resources that could be doing something else, that debt becomes an issue. But there is a little twist to this that is peculiar to our region, and that is the vulnerabilities we face when events occur that effectively decimates your capital stock, the very money you would have borrowed to create that capital stock. And I'm referring here to something like a hurricane. The hurricane comes, gets rid of all of your capital, but it doesn't get rid of the debt, meaning the money you borrowed. And to be able to rebuild, you now end up having to borrow again. And so we need to be a little careful that when we look at that debt stock, how much of it potentially is due to situations outside of our control, like natural hazards, and how much of it is due to poor policies or inadequately targeted investments. And so we should see the borrowing or financing in general as a means to growth, but there's the implementation, the targeting, which is where we started on measure better to target better. The targeting of this to generate the growth, to be able to repay the debt and to maintain some degree of sustainability. So while your question is, I think, very targeted, we do need to separate a couple of key distinctions in my mind as to what that debt is, how it was accumulated, and how it was used before we make a either pejorative or otherwise insinuation that debt and growth are somehow in contra or juxtaposition positions. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Dr. Clark, what are your views on that?
Yeah, debt has been a problem for Caribbean economies for quite some time. And debt is a problem because it snubs out, fiscal space for needed social investment, and it robs a country of the flexibility that it requires to respond to crises. It robs a country of the ability to pursue counter-cyclical policies when those policies might be needed. Now, the accumulation of debt in Caribbean economies, requires analysis. One, as President Leon is saying, one has to be careful not to engage in any reflexive kind of responses. But having said that, I think we can put the debt accumulation in the Caribbean into a couple of buckets. There's certainly the bucket where debt has accumulated due to misguided policy, or policy, as was said earlier, that has been inappropriately targeted. Debt has also been accumulated due to losses in public bodies. National airlines are a ready example of that. Jamaica, for example, would have lost $1 billion in its airline over a long period of time. We'd have lost several $100 million in a bauxite company that the government owned, over $800 million. We'd have lost several $100 million in sugar that the government owned. So losses in state-owned enterprises, huge source of debt accumulation. But there's also debt that has been accumulated due to natural disaster, events beyond our control, where we've needed to borrow to repair, borrow to respond, borrow to rebuild. And that's certainly a major source of debt. And in the case of Jamaica, and I believe to a lesser extent, Trinidad, much lesser extent, Jamaica accumulated a significant amount of debt from the collapse of its financial sector in the 1990s, where the cost of the government's intervention was socialized, and taxpayers bore the burden as opposed to shareholders and depositors in a disproportionate way. So if you put those four together, I think those would be the four primary factors that account for the accumulation of debt in Caribbean economies.
Thank you so much. Dr. Barnett, in your position at Caricom, what do you think about my original question?
Let me be clear. I agree with everything that that Minister Clark and President Leon have said. What I would add to that, though, is the reality that the rate at which debt accumulates is also related to the rate at which we are able to borrow. And the fact of the matter is that because most of our countries have been graduated, we are not able to borrow at concessional rates. We borrow at rates that are much higher than we would have been able to borrow in the past. We're also much more aligned with borrowing on the commercial market, which bears its own risk. And so we have to be careful about that. But when, as a quote unquote middle income country, without access to concessional money, you have to rebuild after a hurricane, what do? You borrow what you need to borrow so you can build back houses and so you can put back a bridge. And that's what many of our countries have done. In the case of the response to this pandemic, countries have not necessarily accessed commercial borrowings, but what many countries have done is repurpose existing loans. So if they were building something in a community or building a road or a bridge, they've now repurposed that to providing basic social safety nets, and the extent to which the payback on that kind of borrowing would be seen is really questionable. But you cannot not do that. You have to respond appropriately when a natural disaster or a pandemic passes through, and you have to respond as a government. And so we cannot ignore that. The one other thing I'd want to add, and CDB would be much better able to explain this. Because of climate change, what we are seeing is that we have to be borrowing more to do the same things. We have to borrow more to build a road now than we would have borrowed 20 years ago, because as the engineering for climate smart building it costs that much more to build a road if you want it to last the 100 years that you're supposed to be investing for. And the climate change is entirely outside of our ability to solve. That's really for the big countries that are causing it to commit to really making the changes that would make us not have to bear those additional costs. And that's a reality. We don't cause it, but we bear the burden.
Dr. Barnett, I am beginning to believe that you're clairvoyant, because my next question was going to be about climate change. But I will start with Dr. Louisi. Dr. Louisi.
Not doctor. Not Dr. Louisi.
Sorry, but to me you are. So, Mr. Louisi, in what ways do you think our region is being affected by the climate crisis? And how do you think we can tap into that $150 billion that we heard is needed to correct the climate crisis? That's my question to you.
Okay, I'll start with the second part first. We have to actually ensure that $150 billion is a reality, because it's really, as it is described, the countries have been kicking the can down the road, promising, and it's not materializing. That I think is a key issue that we need to deal with. The other thing is that I do believe that countries can appreciate what's happening with climate change, because we are seeing it. And I believe that when you look around, you're seeing more intense, more frequent natural disasters related to climate change, hurricanes, we're seeing storms, we're seeing flooding, we're seeing more severe droughts that are affecting how countries and businesses operate. I believe it's actually absolutely essential that we get not just the countries and the public sector, but the private sector to understand the implications and the impacts of climate change, how the way they operate is affecting and impacting climate change, and what they themselves can do. One of the things our Caricom has done as a network of chambers of commerce is put front and center on our agenda, one of our key pillars, the issue of disaster risk resilience. And we have developed a whole program of activities, of knowledge sharing, of information sharing, of training and development. One of the things we recently did was we developed a business guide for small business on climate change, on business continuity planning. We've developed a tool that we could help and you could let small business use to develop their own business continuity planning, so that they could take account of climate change, they could take account of the risks associated with their operations and what they're doing and how they could combat and mitigate the risk. We have done this, and it's only released 2 weeks ago, and we've done training so that chambers of commerce in our network are able to help businesses follow the business guide and use that toolkit to develop the business continuity planning. So I think the whole issue of disaster risk resilience, disaster risk diagnosis, as well as business continuity planning must be mainstreamed in operations of business so that they could do that. And Caricom is playing a key role in strengthening its members' capacity to do that.
Thank you so much. I'm going to turn my attention to Dr. Clark. Dr. Clark, two countries and persons say they're allegedly two of the biggest proponents of the climate crisis did not show up at COP26. And there they had ones that are saying that they need to tap into this money. What are your thoughts on the entire situation as it relates to the climate crisis and the Caribbean being able to get some form of money from what Mr. Luisi said might be a figure that might be pulled out of a hat?
Yes, so we are on the front lines of the climate crisis. Our economies, island states in the Caribbean and the Pacific and elsewhere feel the brunt of rising sea waters, rising temperatures, greater frequency of tropical storms. So I think we have to pursue a bifurcated strategy. I definitely think we have to the extent that we can, take some of these matters into our own hands and do what we can to mitigate and certainly to provide financial protection. And on the other hand, I think we need to work in partnerships and with larger economies to ensure that the problem does not get worse and that the benchmarks and the convergence that's required in emissions and other standards are observed and met and fulfilled. As far as doing what we can, what we're doing here in Jamaica, we've had the direct experience of natural disasters and the frequency of them, exacting a fiscal price and diverting funds from other worthy causes in our budget. And we are implementing, as a result, a multi-layered strategy for the financing of natural disaster risk, where we have a suite of products that can provide resources in the event of a natural disaster. And that lowers risk premium, enhances our rating, and puts us in a position that's better than we'd otherwise be. Now, we'll never be able to accumulate enough fiscal resources to repay the costs of natural disaster. What we aim to do and what our policy aims to achieve, however, is to provide the emergency financing that is required in the event of natural disaster. And it's emergency financing, the financing that you cannot avoid when natural disaster comes, that we seek to be able to have access to through these products. So we have, and this is not a forum on this particular topic, so I won't take too much time on it, but suffice to say, we have multiple layers consisting of budgetary financing on an annual basis, building a natural disaster fund, having credit contingent claims with other multilaterals like the IDB, obviously being a part of the CRIF facility. And finally, we just issued a catastrophe bond, the first island state in the world to independently sponsor a catastrophe bond with the technical assistance and leveraging the balance sheet of the World Bank. So, we are not waiting for the big countries to get it right. I mean, that's definitely a part of the solution and necessary part of the solution. But we are also doing what we can to ensure that we have fiscal resources available in the event disaster strikes. And the vision that we have here in Jamaica is that we can pursue a regional initiative for a catastrophe bond that would cover many more of our islands than just Jamaica. The diversification of risk that it would involve would allow us to achieve greater coverage for each of us at a lower price than if we did it ourselves. So we are taking, we're emphasizing the fiscal response, even as we, pursue other strategies.
Thank you so much. We have to go to break, but I need to ask Dr. Leon this question. I really want to get your thoughts on this. I am no spring chicken, but I am a millennial. And right now, when you look at the global workforce, the majority of persons in the workforce would be millennials. When you go on social media, a lot of millennials, because we're not Greta Thunberg's age, Greta is a Gen Z, a lot of millennials cannot fathom why they focus on climate change when there's so many people fighting after pandemic to put food on their tables. Where is the disconnect between um, those priorities, and where have we gone wrong, and where can we turn around? What are we doing wrong as it relates to educating persons about the importance of the climate crisis?
Thanks, Tony. I think there are two aspects to that question. The first is we probably do have a communication failure between government authorities and the people, as I think was highlighted in the survey at the very beginning of this segment, that says people were looking for, one, more engagement, and second, a yearning for more youth-related focus on activity. And it's clear it's something that one needs to do, but it does tell me that there are two elements that we need to pay a little more attention to. One is the notion of social well-being, social resilience, and the second is about governance. And the governance processes here in terms of how do we communicate, how do we govern, how do we share information, such that the body politic is aware and is cognizant of the constraints in which we operate. And so while the reality is, yes, that some people are in need of food on the table, and that's an immediate need that needs to be communicated about, it is equally true that the climate-related issues we are talking about is of an existential nature. And I raise that to make one connecting point to add to what Minister Clark has already very, very well articulated. And that is, as of today, we are at 1.1% in terms of temperature rise over pre-industrial levels. That temperature is not going to be reversed. What we are talking about is how do we flatten the curve of the eventual rise in temperatures going forward. And so we have an eye on, can we keep it to 1.5, or do we allow it to go to 2.7 or 2.5, as the case may be? And why this becomes important, and I say it's an existential issue, is the flattening of the curve is mitigation. And we need to do everything we can on our own with the larger countries who are creating the problem to mitigate. But the reality is we are at 1.1. And as I said, that cannot be reversed. And we are already seeing the impact of that 1.1. And therefore, the message has to be, we have to continue to live with at least 1.1. And so the game in town for me is adaptation. How do we create a society, both in terms of sharing, in terms of sharing the bad news, as it were, in terms of making them aware, in terms of telling them how our lives will need to be adapted, because where we are now is the very minimum of what we will need to live with going forward. And so both messages need to be communicated. Both messages need to be shared. And I go back to where I started. I think we probably have communication failure, in that we probably have not done enough to be able to make both arguments as being super important, and equally to say why we are doing what we are doing to tackle each of those two in themselves existential problems that we are facing now.
We need the innovators in the region to possibly do a very dynamic documentary on how the climate crisis is affecting our region. But without any further delay, we have an intervener. Her name is Trisha Canis, and she is the president of the Barbados Private Sector Association, and she has a note for you. Thanks, Trisha.
Good night. Good night to the panelists. Thank you so much, Tony, fellow colleagues. If the pandemic has taught us nothing, it has shown up our economic vulnerability vividly. As previously discussed, economic resilience by way of diversification is the only sustainable strategy to buttress the current and future headwinds occasioned by climate change, the continuing impact of the pandemic, and an increasingly hostile and tribal approach by larger developed economies in protecting their interests. For some Caribbean territories, the largest economic threat, apart from the impact of the pandemic on tourism, is the impact of the imminent introduction of a global minimum rate of tax on their international business sectors, which account in most cases for significant proportions of their tax revenues. My question to the panel: what role are your respective organizations playing in advising regional stakeholders and governments on strategies to mitigate this threat?
I will ask Dr. Barnett to address that question.
Thank you very much, Tony, for passing that question to me. The reality is that we are in a situation where the advanced industrial countries have already decided that they're implementing this global minimum tax rate. It's not as if we can tell them not to do it. It's as much as an issue that we as climate change, we have to figure out how we're going to live with it. We can advocate to have them not do it. We can, and we're doing the best we can to explain and indicate the difficulty that will have on those of us who have economies that cater to companies that international companies that have presence in the region. But that is a reality that that we face with the global system in which we live. We lump that together with the issues we have with the risking, the issues we have generally in the approach of the industrial countries in making policies that make it difficult for us when we want to develop new sectors that would draw on the persons in their economies. It's a very difficult one. I suspect we're going to see some economic dislocations take place. The reality with those kinds of policies as well, they're often not targeted at all countries. They are targeted at countries in the developing world that are opening up new sectors. So, for example, when we were talking about de-risking and all of the issues that we faced in the developing world, in the Caribbean in particular, with the new restrictions that were being set up, we were not the only jurisdictions in the world that did what we were being asked not to do, but it is only the jurisdictions in the Caribbean. You have tax-free jurisdictions in Europe, you have tax-free jurisdictions in parts of the US, and those are not being asked to do the same things that we are being asked to do. And so we have to understand sometimes that it is not a level playing field. And we are expecting that there will be issues arising within our economies for those who are going to be affected once that global minimum tax rate gets rolled out. I don't know. We're continuing to advocate to a rethink of that. We're continuing to see how difficult the timing all of that is, because it is going to present dislocations for us. But we are in a situation, the reality of which is that the developed world has already made agreements among themselves to do this. And we are going to be bearing the burden of dealing with that where it affects us as well.
Thank you so much for your contribution. All very interesting. We have Anki, but we have a break. And we'll be right back. Please don't touch your remote controls to all viewers across the region. This is the Central Bank of Barbados' Caribbean Economic Forum. We'll be right back.
If ever there was a time to take care of your mental health, it is now.
Now, when your physical health so clearly impacts your emotional health.
Now, when we need to talk and listen to each other.
Now, when supporting each other means survival.
Now, in a time of COVID-19.
Speak up.
Speak now.
Beat COVID-19.
Call 888-NEW-LIFE, 639-5433.
Jamaica is a beautiful place. Our people have a beautiful spirit, but we are too aggressive, and the way we interact with our friends and neighbors, I genuinely believe that we have the capacity to deal with this problem of violence. But it's going to take all of us. It's going to take every organized group of Jamaicans that we fundamentally reject violence. Violence has no place in a modern society.
Here is a special parenting message brought to you by the National Family Planning Board, 5 Sylvan Avenue, Kingston 5. If you want your children to improve, let them overhear the nice things you say about them to others. That was a special parenting message brought to you by the National Family Planning Board, 5 Sylvan Avenue, Kingston 5.
Hello, Jamaica. I'm Dion Miller. It's unbelievable to me whenever I buck up somebody who is still asking if COVID-19 is real. Because my doctor died of COVID-19. I had COVID recently, and it was a severe case. Most of my lungs were affected. I am so grateful to be alive. Take COVID seriously, guys. Some people won't be affected, that's true, but others may have long-term effects, and some people will die. Let's do all we can to protect ourselves and to protect others.
A message endorsed by the Ministry of Health and Wellness.
To financing and building resilience. One of the challenges we have is poverty, and it's still a disparity across our region. The CDB has an estimated regional growth of about 3.8% for 2021. How do we address the moral challenge of having rural poverty being dominant and indigenous people and single women being most of the dominant persons on the poverty line? How do we now address the issue of getting the greater number of persons across the region above this poverty line? The second issue as it relates to access to financing. Now, how do we ensure that economic growth and development mirror each other? That is, once countries graduate to medium class, medium income groups, how do we ensure that they are now not less able to access financing for social issues such as poverty, which is quite detrimental? How can we ensure growth is improved in this manner? Thank you very much.
This is a question for Dr. Leon.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Let me pack it. One is poverty, and the other is access to finance. I think the whole idea of poverty is and needs to be looked at first outside of the realm of what we normally do, which is to think in terms of growth. I think it's unfortunate that we have for too long simply focused on what was simple to be able to relate to the general masses that countries are growing. But if I can just use the context of COVID to be able to highlight that, what happened out of COVID is, A, you had a reduction in output, but you also had increase in poverty, you had increase in other inequalities, you had gender imbalances, you had education gaps that were springing, all of which led to a significant fall in economic welfare. And therefore, when we talk about our recovery, as meaning we are going to return to GDP levels before the pandemic, it's quite clear we are missing a very, very important component, that the social dimensions, whether we measure it in terms of returning to poverty levels before, or for that matter, moving to the goal of even, say, reducing poverty by 1/2, those have to be brought into the broader picture. And so where we need to be focused on are measures of economic welfare as a means of establishing whether or not we are genuinely growing out of events that have actually occurred. In the case of poverty as one dimension of this broader economic welfare that I'm speaking of, we had made a rather initial estimate that we would need to almost double our investments to even get poverty to 50% of levels it is now. And so it is quite clear tackling poverty is a mammoth task. And if we are to add other dimensions like the other SDGs, it's clear the financing we need is much, much more than is available. And so I think the bigger issue is how do we then tap into access what I'm simply going to call affordable finance. And that affordable finance, how can it be directed in a way that targets what would be higher priority elements? And it is clear that we need to make poverty a high priority. And I think for me, it translates to having a goal whereby we could say all governments in the region want to target, let's say, reducing poverty by 1/2, whatever the levels are now, by a fixed date, and commit to prioritizing the efforts in terms of how they deploy those resources towards eradicating that poverty. And I think we have to be able to see this as a high priority. Now, it will mean, by definition, that some other elements of this broader holistic development context we are talking about will not be able to be met. But it will not be able to be met only in the sense that we cannot obviously do everything at the same time within the finite resources that we have. But ultimately, you have to put priorities, and those priorities have to reflect the social contract that we have between the political and the people as a means of establishing how societies are going to actually function. And so, as I said, for me, it is one, the prioritization, raising it above everything else, especially returning poverty levels to levels that were at some reasonable level at some point in time. At least that's the benchmark we should use, and putting in the appropriate resources in a way that can move the needle on reducing that poverty by a particular point in time and sticking with it. At least that would be the initial line, but you cannot take away from the broader development issue.
Thank you, Dr. Leon. We have an intervener, and she is Renee Atwell. She's the Caricom Youth Ambassador from Trinidad and Tobago. Hi, Renee.
Hi, good evening, Tony, and good evening to the panel. Of course, as a Caribbean youth leader and, of course, dean of the Caricom Youth Ambassador Corps, it would be remiss if I didn't highlight, of course, the importance of youth to the economy and more specifically to sustainable economic growth. Of course, considering that Caricom has a large youth population, it is important for young persons to be provided with opportunities to participate in the economy. However, of course, in order for youth to participate, they must be provided with the skills necessary to do so. And so my question, therefore, really centers on youth economic empowerment. What can we do as a region to ensure that young persons are provided with the knowledge, the skills, and the confidence that they need to participate in the economy, whether it be through formal career or entrepreneurship outside of the formal education system?
Mr. Louisi, I'll ask you to take that question.
Well, I think that I'll probably use the example of the St. Lucia Chamber of Commerce, where I'm the executive director. One of the things that was done a few years ago, almost 20 years ago, was the Chamber bought the franchise for junior achievement, recognizing that if the business community didn't get involved in preparing the next set of entrepreneurs, the next set of employees, you will have a gap. And so we've done that. We've also established a youth business trust. There needs to be a third element which we need to try to work on, and that is developing apprenticeship programs where the business community works with the formal education and academic sector to bring in a cooperative education system where young people get an opportunity whilst they're studying to work within the business community and the private sector. So they nurture the skills, they build a network from early. The vast majority of our population is generally on the youth side. So you already have a demographic that is available and in the business community. But most times the education does not necessarily prepare them for what is required. There's a mismatch between what is required in the business community, the opportunities available in the economy, and what is being done at the education level. So we need to find a way to bring that closer together and integrate. And I think that can be done by the partnerships, by the involvement, by apprenticeship programs, and involving the business community in defining and designing the curriculum, so that the business community is not just seen as financing, but they are actually helping determine what the students are doing. And I think if we could bring academia and the business community together, the business community could get resources or human resources, and the academia could get a better reflection of what is required in the business community.
Dr. Clark, please don't rest on your laurels. I have a Scott Bonnet question for you. But before we get to that question, we have an email question that has been submitted. When we realize regional economic growth and development, if we do not have the political will to operate as a single unit in many areas across the English-speaking Caribbean,
to do certain things, and in particular, we're talking about building the CSME, the Caricom Single Market and Economy. The decision to do that taken some time ago required us to build out a structure. And the building out of that structure is what we're talking about when we say it's taken us time to operate as a unit, or however the question was put. As I said, the reality is it's a work in progress. The reality is that what we've seen in the last 20 months is a level of cooperation and collaboration because of being in this crisis, where our political leaders have recommitted and have placed greater emphasis on some of the things that we do need to do together to create a basis for regional economic growth for the economy of the region as a whole. But always remember, growth for the regional economy is really the sum of economic growth in each of our countries. So it's not necessarily only a regional policy that we're talking about. We're talking about what countries do at the national level in order to be able to, one, implement those things that are required to be implemented to bring this regional economic space into being, but two, also do the things that they need to do to make sure that all of our individual regional economies are strong, that we're growing young entrepreneurs, that we are promoting innovation, that we are doing all of those things at the national levels, because at the end, the regional level really is the sum total of the national levels. Now, in terms of what we need to do at the Caricom level, separate and apart from implementing those things that we're talking about, such as free movement, common policies for finance, and those kinds of developments, we also, as regional institutions, and I've had this conversation with President Leon here and with other institutions, as regional institutions, we need to work better together. We need to collaborate more. We need to cooperate, because each of us come to the table as regional institutions with particular skills, expertise, resources. And if we bring those together in a more effective way, it means that we are able to reduce duplication. We are able to make sure that our strategies are mutually supportive, those kinds of things. And therefore, it's important for us to as regional institutions, understand that we also need to work together in a more collaborative way. And some of that we're already beginning to talk about. We've talked about that in the past, and we will continue to ensure that we get that improved collaboration going, because that's one of the important parts of ensuring that this regional space that we're talking about is not only a regional economic space, it's a regional knowledge space, it's a regional space within which we do everything together. And therefore we have to understand the coming together of what happens at the national level to create the regional space that we're talking about. And yes, we need good policies at the regional level. We also need good policies at the national level.
If I have time, I'm going to ask you to give the region a scorecard on regional integration. But let me get to this Scotch bonnet question. Jamaica is doing very well. I saw the news about 2 weeks ago. You have an estimated 6.3% growth between July and September. You're the Minister of Finance, so a lot of that is as a result of your very hard work. You also spoke about manufacturing. And it has been rumored, I don't like rumors, but have to ask you, it has been rumored that Jamaica is really looking at being the juggernaut, the China of the Caribbean. And somebody said there's a quote 100 years ago that they said before China got to its level, let China sleep because when she wakes, the world would know. Is that what Jamaica is really going for?
Normally, Scotch bonnet is served normally with some curry goat or some ackee and saltfish. I'm trying to find the curry goat in the question, but look, Jamaica has been recovering so far handsomely from this pandemic. In prior crisis, it's taken us 10 years to recover. This time around. First quarter was 14%, second quarter estimated at 6%. Full fiscal year might be, different persons are projected. IMF was the latest one, they projected 8%. So by all accounts, certainly, and certainly by reference to historical experience and reference to the Caribbean, Jamaica is definitely doing quite well as far as economic recovery is concerned. Jamaica, they say preparation is better than good luck. We went into this crisis, and just before we had, privatized a few assets that we intended to use to pay down on debt, some of which we still did. And we had put money away in a disaster fund. We had accumulated $1 billion of non-borrowed reserves over the previous 3 years. We had reintegrated public bodies. Maybe the month or 2 months before, we had a public body. It was a big conglomerate 10 years ago, and all of its subsidiaries over the last 10 years have been sold or closed. We had only one left. The parent company was not existed, and the parent company had $5 billion in deposits. We got rid of that structure, faced, opposition locally to do it, but that yielded, a big amount of billions, 5 or 6 billion Jamaican dollars. So we went into the pandemic with over $73 billion of cash resources, like 3.5% of GDP. And that allowed us to absorb and of course, the structural adjustment over 2 IMF programs. That allowed us to absorb the shock of the pandemic, which was as hard as anywhere else. 10% of GDP, 10% of the workforce lost their jobs. But that economic shock did not result in other crises. And what has happened in the past is that we have an economic shock, and because we don't have buffers, right, it leads to either a debt crisis, a financial crisis, a fiscal crisis, or a balance of payment crisis. In this case, in this pandemic, even though we lost $2.5 billion of foreign exchange inflows, 80% of our foreign exchange inflows evaporated, we never ended up with a balance of payment crisis, as we're seeing in a couple of countries in the Caribbean region. Why? Well, we had pursued policies towards implementing inflation targeting, started in just a few years earlier, and we had, between 2016 and 2019, we had reserves that were borrowed, right, or were linked to borrowings, and we reversed about $1 billion of that over that time period. And I mentioned others. We put away some funds. We had 100 million Jamaican dollars in a contingency fund for 30 years. In 2018-19 and 2019-20, we increased that 45 times. So we went into the crisis with 4.5 billion Jamaican dollars of disaster funds, which we drew down the first few weeks of the pandemic. We've since replaced it. So though we had lost a lot of 80% of our foreign exchange inflows, we never had a balance of payment crisis. Although our debt shot up from 94% to 110, one of the highest in the region, second only maybe to Barbados, right? Although our debt shot up extremely high, we never ended up with a fiscal crisis. We went into this crisis with more debt than several countries in the Caribbean, most countries in the Caribbean. But again, because of what I described, we had the buffers, we had those fiscal resources, those cash resources that we had just harnessed in our reform program. We were able to respond without the shock generating other crises. And it's a great lesson that if you can maintain stability throughout a crisis, it doesn't mean it's not painful. It doesn't mean you don't suffer economic loss. It doesn't mean you don't suffer loss of jobs. But what it means is that you have the flexibility to respond to the crisis in a way that does not precipitate other crises. So if you look on the back of a piece of paper, other countries in the Caribbean went into this crisis with better metrics than we did. They had higher growth rates than we had. They had lower debt than we had. Okay, and I don't want to call any names, but those who are familiar with Caribbean economics would know. But though they had better growth rates and lower debt ratios, etc., we were able to maneuver through the crisis significantly better because we had higher buffers, and as I said, many of them just harnessed preparation better than good luck, and we had a level of institutional stability. Now, in terms of the Scotch bonnet element of your question, Jamaica's always been a country with huge ambitions, a country that has a worldview and sees itself with a destiny and a message for the world. The leaders who have come out of Jamaica, the messengers and the prophets, so to speak, have all espoused that kind of ideological view about Jamaica. So it shouldn't surprise anyone if Jamaica wants to be strong. But let's make no mistake about it. Our neighbors in the Caribbean region start out in 2021 with far higher levels of per capita GDP than Jamaica. So in the Eastern Caribbean, in the Northern Caribbean, in Bahamas, etc., per capita GDP levels and levels of that are far higher than Jamaica. So we're doing well now, and we're doing better than we have done in the past, and we're recovering a bit faster than the rest of the region. But we have a long way to go. But we are Jamaica has always seen itself as a place of destiny to fulfill a message for the world. And without any offense to any other region, all of these are compatible visions. We see Jamaica as the center of economic, cultural, and social life in the Caribbean, and you're all welcome at any time.
I realize that you said everything, but whether or not you intend to be the China of the Caribbean. But y'all are, as you say, liquor, but you're talking. I'm going to ask. You're pressed for time, but I have to ask Dr. Leon to weigh in on that question and all that Dr. Clark would have said.
Let me probably make one point, Tony. I think what Dr. Clark or Minister Clark has said encapsulates exactly where we started. What really matters and what really distinguishes our countries from the other broader developed countries we compare with is what we are calling your internal resilience capacity. And your internal resilience capacity is what allows you to remain on a stable, steady course. And it's exactly what the minister described. It depends on how you started, your initial conditions, but it equally depends on what resources you have, what institutional processes, governance that you have, how your productive capacity is actually diversified to allow you to recover, and your ability to finance that particular line. And so when he says others had metrics that were different or worse or better than Jamaica, whether it is debt or for that matter growth, this is not the totality of the picture. The picture is captured in internal resilience capacity. And if we can focus on that and use this as a measure of how we can get out of shocks, how we can regenerate ourselves, and how we can propel ourselves to the next level, then I think we begin to hit a really sweet spot in terms of managing our economies going forward. So I think Minister Clark gave you an excellent rendition there about internal resilience capacity.
What do you say? I had the Scotch bonnet without responding. No, I was able to digest the Scotch bonnet, right?
I only have Scotch bonnet up here, but we only have 5 more minutes. I could talk to you for the rest of the night. I wanted to get an idea from you very quickly so we don't get cut off. What is your vision for the Caribbean? You know, what is your vision? And each of you manage very, very large portfolios. What is your vision for the Caribbean? Where do you see the Caribbean in 15 years? Final thoughts.
Can I go first, Tony?
Of course. Ladies first. Gender.
Well, let me tell you, we are at a very exciting time right now. There's opportunity in the challenges that we face, and really, there's a lot that we can do to reposition, to treat with the underlying problems that we have. One of the key things that we always talk about in the Caricom is the CSME, the Caricom Single Market and Economy. That is the singular focus of what we've been trying to build. And the time is right, I think, for us to get those done. I'm sorry, my voice is going. You asked before what grade I would give to just kind of ask it in passing. Well, it depends on whether you're talking about desire or delivery. And there is a great desire at this time, I would think, because countries recognize more and more, or member states are recognizing how important it is for us to realize the central elements of the CSME. And so we're at a place, I think, where we can get those key things done. One of the things we have to recognize is that we can spend a lot of time creating the infrastructure, but the CSME really is about the people. It's really about people getting up and moving. It is really about people moving from country to country. It's about the private sector being able to take advantage of what we're trying to do to make it easier to do business within the Caribbean. Do CARICOM nationals feel as if they are a part of CARICOM, of the regional initiative? Quite honestly, I would say not as much as we would want them to be. Part of that is the fact that we don't do enough about making the good stories come out. And therefore, the only thing we hear is when the not good stories come out. And so one of the things that we want to be able to do as we move ahead is to make sure that we focus on the things that we do well together. That is what I will say.
We are pressed for time. I am looking at production. I don't even know if we have any more time. But it's good to hear a woman really wrap that up. It has been a pleasure to have this conversation with all of you. Very dynamic. You're great. There's a lot of respect for you throughout the region. This has been the Central Bank's CARICOM Economic Forum. I want to thank each of you. God bless the Caribbean. God bless the Republic of Barbados. Feels so good saying that. And this has been an amazing year hosting this. Merry Christmas and have a wonderful night.
What can a little germs do?